The morning sun hung low over Sycamore Ridge, a neighborhood built with perfect symmetry. The grass on each lawn seemed trimmed with military precision, the houses aligned as if they had been copied and pasted. To anyone passing through, it looked like a peaceful community. But behind that veneer of harmony, power games brewed, controlled by the iron hand of the Homeowners Association. Blake preferred silence. After 35 years in uniform, years of battlefields, strategy rooms, and the deafening roar of combat, he wanted nothing more than to tend his roses and read the paper beside his wife, Linda. Retirement was supposed to be a reprieve, not another battlefield. Yet, he quickly realized that peace is fragile, and tyrants come in all forms. The tyrant of Sycamore Ridge was a woman everyone quietly called Karen. Her real name was Margaret Albright, but the nickname fit too perfectly. Karen was the president of the HOA, and she wore that title as if it were a crown. Each week, she patrolled the sidewalks with a clipboard tucked under her arm, scanning homes for violations as if she were enforcing martial law. She fined neighbors for bird feeders, for curtains too bold in color, even for the type of mulch in their flower beds. Most grumbled, paid, and moved on. Resistance, after all, was punished swiftly. Blake and Linda kept their home tidy, but perfection was subjective in Karen's eyes. The trouble began with something so small it almost felt comical, a ceramic flower pot painted a deep cobalt blue. Linda had chosen it during a trip to Santa Fe, charmed by its vivid shade. She placed it proudly by their mailbox, where it caught the morning light. To Karen, however, that splash of color was non-compliant with community aesthetic guidelines. Within days, a notice arrived in their mailbox. Fine, $250. Infraction, unauthorized exterior decoration. Linda laughed at first. She thought it must be a mistake, some clerical slip. But when she called the HOA office, Karen herself answered with icy certainty. Not a mistake. You'll need to remove the pot and pay the fine immediately. Rules are rules. Linda's temper was usually gentle, but the tone cut her. The pot wasn't an eyesore, it was beautiful, personal. To her, it was a small act of joy. She hung up without another word and walked outside, holding the letter in one hand and the shredder bin in the other. Blake watched from the porch, brow furrowed. On the lawn, in full view of the street, Linda tore the letter into strips. Slowly at first, then faster, until the paper became ribbons in her hands. She let them fall into the shredder bin, her chin lifted in quiet defiance. A neighbor mowing his lawn stopped to watch, his eyes wide. Two teenagers paused on their bikes. Even Blake felt a swell of pride. His wife, who had endured years of moving base to base, raising their children alone while he was away, was making her stand. But Karen was there. Of course she was. She happened to be walking her daily patrol, clipboard in hand. Her mouth dropped open, then tightened into a line. She marched up the sidewalk, heels clacking like gunfire. Excuse me, did you just destroy an official HOA document? Linda didn't flinch. I destroyed garbage. Karen's face reddened. She snatched her phone from her purse. You'll regret this, she hissed. You think the rules don't apply to you? This is property destruction. This is aggression. I'm calling the police. Blake stepped forward. His voice was calm but carried a weight that made most men hesitate. That won't be necessary. My wife exercised her right to dispose of a piece of paper. Nothing more. But Karen was already dialing, her voice loud enough for the gathering neighbors to hear. Yes, operator? I need officers dispatched immediately. A resident is destroying HOA property and acting hostile. Yes, hostile. I feel threatened. Her words twisted reality into something grotesque. Blake's jaw tightened, but Linda put a hand on his arm. She knew that tone, restrained fury honed over decades. He could command armies, but this was a suburban street. A different kind of war. By the time Karen ended her call, a crowd had formed, neighbors curious, whispering, some shaking their heads. For years they had endured Karen's petty reign, but few dared confront her. Now they saw resistance. Karen smirked as she tucked her phone away. The law will handle this. You'll learn that no one is above the rules." Blake said nothing. He simply guided Linda back toward the porch, his hand steady on hers. He'd seen bigger threats than Karen. But the insult lingered, sharp as shrapnel. Calling the police over a flower pot and a shredded letter? That was more than petty power. It was a declaration of war. The sound of sirens in the distance grew louder. Neighbors leaned forward, waiting. Karen folded her arms triumphantly, convinced she had won. But Blake's eyes narrowed. He had no intention of bowing to tyranny, certainly not here, in his own neighborhood. The squad car turned the corner, lights flashing. And as the officers stepped out, a storm was about to begin. The squad car rolled to a stop, its siren falling silent, though the flashing lights painted the tidy street in alternating washes of red and blue. Karen straightened her posture like a queen awaiting her guards, one hand gripping her clipboard as if it were a scepter. Two officers stepped out, one younger, stiff with procedure, the other older, his movements calm, seasoned. The younger officer's hand hovered near his belt as he surveyed the scene. The older one scanned the gathering of neighbors before settling his gaze on Blake and Linda. Karen wasted no time. She rushed forward, voice shrill. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. These two have been hostile, destroying official HOA property, threatening me, frightening the neighborhood. I demand you arrest them immediately." Gasps rippled through the small crowd. A few neighbors exchanged skeptical glances, but none spoke up. Karen had a way of silencing dissent. The younger officer adjusted his cap. "Ma'am, we'll need you to slow down. What exactly happened here?" Karen gestured dramatically toward Linda. She ripped up an official notice, an HOA violation letter. That's destruction of property. And her husband, she jabbed a finger at Blake, used intimidating language. I felt unsafe. Linda stood tall, her shredded bin still at her feet, her chin unbowed. Blake remained beside her, arms folded, eyes steady. He had learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than shouting. The older officer took a step forward. His expression, however, shifted the moment Blake's name left Karen's lips. Intimidation? By who? He asked. Karen repeated, slower this time, savoring the sound of accusation. By Blake. This man here. The officer froze. His brow furrowed. Wait, General Blake. The crowd stirred. Karen blinked, momentarily thrown off. General? No, he's just a stubborn old man who thinks the rules don't apply to him. But the officer didn't look away from Blake. Recognition dawned, and respect followed. His posture straightened as if instinct pulled him to attention. Sir, forgive me. I didn't expect to meet you here. I'm Officer Daniels. 20 years ago, I served under your command in Fallujah. The street went silent. Even the younger officer glanced sideways, caught off guard by the sudden shift in tone. Daniels' voice carried no doubt. This wasn't just a man in retirement. This was someone who had once commanded legions, who had faced chaos with steadiness. Karen tried to laugh it off, though her voice wavered. Oh, please. That doesn't change the fact he's broken our community rules. Respect for the military doesn't mean disrespect for the HOA. But her certainty had slipped. Neighbors began whispering, some recalling old news articles, others piecing together why Blake had always carried himself with quiet authority. Daniels turned back to Karen, his tone sharpening. Ma'am, tearing up a letter you placed in his mailbox isn't destruction of property. That's junk mail at best. And calling this intimidation? He gestured toward Blake, whose arms remained folded. I don't see any aggression here. Only restraint. Karen sputtered, her face flushed. You don't understand. If we let people like them ignore the rules, the entire neighborhood falls apart. Daniels shook his head. What falls apart is trust when rules are abused. My job is to enforce the law, not your personal vendettas. The crowd murmured louder now, emboldened. Some neighbors nodded subtly toward Linda, sympathy in their eyes. For the first time, Karen seemed isolated. Blake finally spoke, his voice calm but carrying weight. My wife disposed of a letter in our yard. You escalated it into a criminal accusation. This neighborhood deserves leadership, not tyranny. Daniels gave a small nod, affirming the truth in the words. The younger officer, though less certain, followed his partner's lead and stepped back. The confrontation was deflating, the threat of arrest dissolved. Karen's mouth opened and closed, desperate for footing. But the balance had shifted. The sight of a respected officer addressing Blake as general had punctured her authority. She clutched her clipboard tighter, but the symbol of power now looked flimsy in her hands. "Fine," she snapped, though her voice cracked. "But this isn't over. The HOA will deal with you. You can't just waltz around here ignoring regulations." Daniels met her eyes evenly. "I suggest you reconsider how you use your position, ma'am. Wasting police resources on personal disputes is no small matter." Karen glared, but the warning landed. She turned sharply on her heel, storming off with her clipboard, muttering about emergency board meetings and legal consequences. The officers lingered only long enough to ensure tempers cooled. Daniels offered Blake a firm handshake. "It's an honor, sir. You always told us battles weren't just fought overseas. Seems you were right." Blake returned the handshake, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, officer. Discipline matters everywhere." When the squad car pulled away, the crowd dispersed in quiet waves. But beneath their whispers lay a current of something new, hope that maybe Karen's reign wasn't as unshakable as it seemed. Linda turned to her husband, her eyes narrowing with the fire of someone who had endured too much. "She won't stop." Blake glanced at the cobalt pot still gleaming by the mailbox. His lips pressed into a thin line. "No. She won't. But neither will we." The war in Sycamore Ridge had only just begun. For a brief moment, after the police car disappeared down the street, Blake hoped the confrontation had ended the matter. But Karen was not the kind of person who surrendered. Instead, she doubled down. Within 48 hours, another envelope appeared in Blake's mailbox, bold red letters stamped across the front. Notice of violation. This time, the supposed infraction was the placement of their trash cans, visible from the street for longer than permitted. Linda rolled her eyes. They had pulled the bins in within minutes of pickup, but Karen's accusation made it sound like they had left them there for days. Blake placed the notice on his desk without a word. A day later, another violation arrived, unauthorized holiday decoration. Linda had hung a small autumn wreath on their front door. "Apparently, nature is offensive now," she muttered. And then came the one that made Blake's jaw clench, improper flag display. A small American flag, planted respectfully in their garden, had been deemed non-compliant. It was no longer about rules. It was about domination. Blake recognized the pattern. He had seen it in war zones, in dictators who clung to power by punishing any hint of defiance. Petty harassment was meant to grind people down until resistance seemed impossible. But Blake had not survived decades of service by surrendering to pressure. He would not start now. Instead of reacting with anger, he responded with discipline. He retrieved the HOA bylaws, an 8-inch thick binder neighbors usually left to gather dust. Night after night, he read through the clauses, page by page, highlighting contradictions and loopholes. The language was deliberately vague, designed to give maximum power to the board. But vague language was also weak, riddled with exploitable cracks. Linda watched him with quiet admiration. "You're treating this like a mission." Blake didn't look up from his notes. "That's exactly what it is." Meanwhile, Karen's campaign grew louder. She called an emergency board meeting, rallying her small circle of loyalists. Word spread through the neighborhood, whispers of fines, threats of liens, rumors that Karen planned to sue Blake for harassment. Fear hung in the air. But Blake wasn't alone. Neighbors, quietly resentful of Karen's reign, began stopping by. A couple down the street confessed they had paid over $1,000 in fines for non-compliant garden lights. An elderly widow revealed she had been threatened with foreclosure over a paint shade deemed too beige. Each story sharpened Blake's resolve. He listened carefully, documenting every complaint. He organized the evidence like a field report, each violation cross-referenced against the bylaws. Slowly, a pattern emerged, funds collected from fines that didn't match the HOA's financial statements. Karen wasn't just petty, she was sloppy. The turning point came when Blake discovered records of Karen approving reimbursements to herself, expenses labeled as administrative costs that drained thousands from the HOA's account. It was the kind of mismanagement that could dissolve the board entirely. When he showed Linda, she placed a hand over his. "This is it, isn't it?" He nodded once. "She thinks this is her kingdom. She's about to find out it isn't." The night of the board meeting, the community center buzzed with tension. Folding chairs filled with residents, some clutching envelopes of fines, others whispering nervously. Karen sat at the front table, clipboard replaced with a gavel she struck against the wood for order. "Tonight," she announced, "we address repeated violations by Mr. and Mrs. Blake, whose disregard for our community rules threatens the harmony of Sycamore Ridge." Her voice carried, shrill and commanding, but there was a crack beneath the surface. Too many eyes were skeptical now, too many whispers refusing to be silenced. Blake rose from his seat. He carried no papers in his hands, no dramatic gestures. His calm presence alone quieted the room. "With respect," he began, his voice steady, "this meeting isn't about harmony. It's about control. And tonight, the truth deserves to be heard." Karen scoffed, slamming her gavel. "You are not recognized." But he continued, unshaken. "Neighbors, you've been told to accept every fine, every threat, without question. Yet the bylaws say otherwise. They promise fairness, transparency, accountability." He pulled a folder from beneath his chair and laid it on the table before the board. "These are financial records, and they reveal a different story. Funds diverted, expenses misreported, money spent without your consent." The room erupted in gasps. Karen's face drained of color. She reached for the folder, but Blake slid it away. "Not yet," he said calmly. "Everyone will see this in due time. But tonight, you should know this. Abuse of power ends when people stop being afraid." The neighbors began murmuring louder now, their frustration boiling into open dissent. One man stood and shouted, "We've had enough of this." Another woman added, "You've been bleeding us dry for years." Karen banged her gavel desperately. "Order! Order!" But her voice had lost its command. Blake's eyes never left hers. He didn't need to shout. His quiet authority spoke louder than any gavel. The tide had shifted. The boardroom was no longer her throne. It was a tribunal, and Karen was the one on trial. The boardroom was no longer Karen's stage. The gavel trembled in her hand, each strike weaker than the last as the crowd's voices grew louder, emboldened by Blake's calm revelations. For years, neighbors had endured her petty fines and endless threats, but now, the mask had slipped. Blake remained standing, his presence commanding without aggression. He didn't need to raise his voice. The room leaned toward him instinctively. "You trusted this board to protect your community," he said, his words deliberate. "Instead, it has been used as a weapon, not to serve you, but to control you." A murmur of agreement rolled through the audience. Some residents nodded, others clutched their violation notices like proof of wounds finally acknowledged. Karen slammed the gavel once more, desperation breaking through her composure. "Lies. Fabrications. This man is manipulating you. He's trying to undermine the HOA so he can do whatever he pleases." Blake opened the folder in his hand, revealing copies of financial records. His voice was steady, unshaken. These documents were obtained from the HOA's own filings. They show thousands of dollars in administrative reimbursements to you, Ms. Albright, payments without board approval, and transfers into accounts not registered under the association's name. Gasps filled the room. One board member leaned over to study the page, his expression hardening as he realized the truth. Another shook her head in disbelief, whispering to the neighbor beside her. "You can't prove anything," Karen barked, but the cracks were showing. Her cheeks flushed crimson, her words a brittle shield against the rising tide. Blake didn't flinch. "Proof doesn't vanish because you shout. The people here deserve transparency, and they will have it." At that moment, the doors at the back of the hall opened, and Officer Daniels stepped inside, drawn by the escalating tension. His presence silenced the room. He scanned the crowd, then fixed his gaze on Karen. "I heard raised voices," he said. "Everything all right here?" Karen straightened, seizing the chance to reclaim ground. "Officer, thank goodness. This man is slandering me, disrupting official proceedings." But Daniels held up a hand. "Ms. Albright, I've warned you before about abusing authority. From what I'm hearing, it seems your community deserves answers." Her voice faltered. "You're all conspiring against me. You don't understand what it takes to keep order." Daniels turned toward the residents. "Order doesn't come from fear. It comes from fairness." The room erupted in applause, small at first, then swelling as neighbors found their courage. Years of silent resentment broke free in a chorus of agreement. Blake stepped aside, letting the momentum belong to them. This wasn't his victory alone. It was theirs. One by one, residents stood and voiced their stories: fines for harmless decorations, threats of foreclosure, intimidation for questioning rules. Each testimony hammered another nail into Karen's crumbling authority. Finally, one of the board members rose, his voice carrying above the din. "I motion to hold a vote of no confidence. Effective immediately." The words cut like a blade. The other board members, faces pale, exchanged glances before nodding. Hands went up across the room, neighbor after neighbor declaring the end of Karen's reign. The majority was overwhelming. The gavel slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. For the first time, Karen looked small, her posture sagging, her power dissolved in the simple act of a community reclaiming its voice. "It's not over," she muttered, but the words rang hollow. She gathered her papers and stormed from the hall, shoulders stiff, though no one moved to stop her. The door shut behind her, leaving only the echoes of her departure. Silence followed, heavy but liberating. Then applause broke out again, louder this time, filling the room with something that had been absent for too long: relief. A neighbor approached Blake, gratitude in his eyes. "You did what none of us could. You stood up to her." Blake shook his head. "You all stood up tonight. That's what matters." Later, back at home, Linda placed the cobalt pot more prominently by the mailbox. It gleamed in the evening light, untouchable now. On Blake's desk sat the shredded remains of the first fine, carefully pressed and framed. A reminder not of conflict, but of resistance. As he looked at it, he thought of battles fought on distant soil, wars waged against enemies with weapons and fire. And now, this smaller war, fought with words, documents, and courage. Both had the same purpose: to protect people from tyranny, no matter its form. Linda joined him, her hand resting on his shoulder. "It's over," she whispered. Blake nodded, though his eyes remained distant.
"For now."
But freedom always demands vigilance. Even here. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet again. Lawns trimmed, porches lit, the world appearing perfect. But this time, beneath the symmetry, there was something stronger than fear. There was unity. And at the center of it, a general who had once defended a nation and now defended a street.